Climate Change, Displacement, and Resettlement, Research and Policy Agendas Post-COP26. The webinar is hosted by the University of Dundee in Scotland and jointly organized with the Christian Michelsen Institute in Blerk in Norway. And we are here with generous funding from the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies, who sponsored our event today. Before going any further and describing the event and diving into the presentations, I'd like to take a moment for Professor Shane O'Neill from the University of Dundee to say some opening words. Professor O'Neill, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Alder. So first of all, I'd just like to welcome on behalf of the principal of the University of Dundee, Professor Ian Gillespie, who can't be here because he's just chairing a meeting of our University Senate, which I'll have to unfortunately join him at shortly. But I'm the Senior Vice Principal. I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the University of Dundee and the Michelsen Institute, and many thanks to all of you involved who've helped make this happen, both those who've supported and funded it and put time into organising it, and those of you who've taken the time out to participate in it. Obviously, it's great to see this international collaboration dealing with a series of global challenges related to climate change, of course. Our university has sent a lot of participants to COP26. We're delighted to be in a position where we all know the league tables aren't perfect and none of them have the right methods, but we're particularly pleased that we were ranked first in the UK and fifth in the world for the Climate Action SDG in the Times Higher Education Impact League tables. That's something we're very proud of because we think it's some of the most important work that we do. So I think just to reinforce the fact that we as a university see this at the heart of our mission to address global challenges and to address them in a way that sees the connections between them, that not only recognizes that most of the most significant problems and challenges we face in the world transgress national boundaries, that they need global solutions, but also that they're interconnected. And I'm delighted to see on the agenda for this event, you're addressing not only issues of climate change, but also migration, refugees, vulnerable populations, impacts of armed conflicts, and of course, COVID. So I think that is really encouraging to see, and I wish you all the very best with that work. So one thing we're doing at the moment at the university is we're engaging in consultation on a new institutional strategy. And this kind of work, this kind of seminar, this kind of global collaboration is very much at the heart of what we want to see prioritized in our work. We think of ourselves as a university. We're privileged to work in higher education. For those of us who work in research institutes or in universities, we're privileged to be able to spend time assessing and analysing some of the problems that we face in the world. And we really have a responsibility to try to share that through policy relevant research so that we're actually making a positive difference. So we see the social purpose of making a difference in the world, increasing equal freedom for all human beings at the absolute heart of our mission. So everything we do, whether it's in education, research, engagement, global collaboration, and so on, should be serving that purpose of enhancing, as I say, equal freedom for all, identifying those obstacles to achieving those goals and providing some kind of relevant, policy relevant outcomes so that we can remove those obstacles and make progress. So it's great to see that this kind of collaboration driven by humanitarian praxis, and I wish you all the very best with it, and delighted that we're hosting it in collaboration with the Michelsen Institute. So I hope you enjoy it and take a lot of benefit from the opportunity you have to exchange ideas and engage with one another on these critically important issues.
Professor O'Neill, thank you so much for those kind words of welcome. And thank you also for helping to frame the workshop in the context of the bigger picture of both research and policy and globally important goals. I think those are thoughts that we'll come back to over the course of the next couple of hours. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I'll turn to beginning the session. I introduced myself as people were logging in, but in case it was out of sync with some of you having your audio activated, I'll go ahead again. My name is Alder Keleman Saxena. I'm an environmental anthropologist. I'm based at the Christian Michelsen Institute and also Northern Arizona University. I'll be the moderator for the forthcoming panel. And I'll say just a couple of things about the logistics today. As you most likely know, the webinar is organized as a two-part session. The first part, which will take place over approximately the next hour, will consist of a series of 3 presentations on academic research projects. These address the relationships linking climate change, human displacement, and resettlement. Each of these presentations will take about 15 minutes and will be followed by remarks by Dr. Ilan Kelman of University College London, who is our esteemed discussant for the panel. Following his remarks, we'll have a short Q&A session and then a brief break before beginning the second half of the webinar. That will be a policy panel moderated by Dr. Antonio de Lauri. I don't want to delay too much more before getting to the presentations, but I would like to say a few words to frame the projects we're about to hear from. As we are all aware, changes in the Earth's climate are already driving significant social environmental disruptions and will continue to do so in the coming decades. The most recent IPCC report suggested that even in a best-case scenario, we should anticipate disrupted weather patterns and extreme weather events for at least the coming 20 years, and potentially far longer if decisive actions are not taken to reduce global emissions of CO2 and other pollutants. These circumstances, especially when coupled with other social political pressures, stand to drive sharp increases in forced displacement and migration. A recent World Bank report projected that by 2050, there could be as many as 216 million internal climate migrants, that is, people displaced within their own country's borders. In 2020, a report by the Institute for Economics and Peace projected that as many as 1.2 billion people could be displaced by climate change by 2050. They used a methodology that took into account both vulnerability to ecological threats and political instability. While it remains critically important for scholars and advocates to push our governments to take more decisive action to mitigate global temperature rise, at this point it also seems critical to envision a future in which climate-driven displacement and both temporary and long-term resettlement will be issues of collective concern. The 3 presentations you are about to hear address a narrow but important set of questions within these larger issues. While these projects have been funded and conducted independently, they share 2 key characteristics. First, they focus on environmental change not just as a driver of migration, but also as a characteristic of resettlement. All 3 of these projects ask questions about the environmental dynamics that emerge in long-term resettlement sites for refugees and internally displaced persons. Second, these projects also all entail a mixture of methods for collecting and analyzing data. Specifically in their conceptualization and to varying degrees in their implementation, they all combine remote sensing and other forms of mapping with qualitative ground-level data. I say to varying degrees because, as you will hear, the projects have all had to be modified as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and 2 of them are still ongoing. In conversation with each other, we hope that these projects offer a starting point for thinking about climate displacement and resettlement, both in terms of what it implies for human rights and the environment, and in terms of the methodological tools and approaches available for research on this topic. With that, let's begin the first presentation by Lorraine van Blerk and Mark Cutler, who are both professors of geography and environmental science at the University of Dundee. Their presentation is titled Environmental Change and Sustainable Livelihoods in Ugandan Refugee Hosting Landscapes.
Hello everyone, my name is Mark Cutler, and along with my co-presenter Lorraine van Blerk, we've been privileged enough to be working on a project with a group of experienced and early career researchers from the University of Dundee in Scotland and at Makerere University in Uganda. And our project, which has been funded by the Scottish Funding Council's Global Challenges Research Fund, has been looking at environmental change and sustainable livelihoods in Ugandan refugee hosting landscapes. We focused particularly on Uganda, largely because of existing collaborations that we had there, but also because Uganda is host to one of the largest refugee populations globally. And through protracted crisis has been hosting refugees for many decades, but in recent years, renewed waves, particularly of people coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo and from South Sudan, have been entering Uganda. We also wanted to do this research because we are aware of significant environmental change in refugee hosting landscapes, but this is an area that's been poorly studied in the past. And as part of that, there seems to be a dominant narrative of its refugees themselves degrading landscapes, and in particular degrading forested landscapes in and around refugee settlements. So the aim of the project was to take forward understanding human-environment interactions under critical conditions of refugee crises, and we wanted to provide some sort of evidence-based research which could then be inform policy and practice within these landscapes. And to do this, we felt that there needed to be a blend of social science methods, but also Earth observation methods to explore the impacts on and around refugee hosting landscapes, but also then the development of sustainable livelihoods. To provide this evidence, we decided to adopt a case study approach, looking in particular at two different settlements with different population dynamics, cultural context, and environmental and ecological conditions. Working with our advisory board that was made up of representatives from government, NGOs and other agencies, we settled on Bidi Bidi in the north. Established in 2016, it houses approximately 239,000 refugees, and they come mainly from South Sudan. And to contrast that, we settled on Changwali in the west of Uganda, much further south, very different ecological conditions there and much less seasonality than we see in the north, but also established in 1960, so it's been around for a lot longer, and has a slightly smaller population of 126,000 refugees, and these come mainly from the Democratic Republic of Congo. At both sites, we adopted a mixed methods approach, engaging with both the refugee and the host communities. We began with a pre-survey, engaging with 140 households across both sites using a tablet-based questionnaire. This was then extended, with encouragement from our advisory board, to 1,000 households in each site. We followed that up by in-depth interviews, 150 in total, with up to 4 members of 20 households in each site, as well as some key stakeholder interviews as well. And then finally, we looked at participatory mapping, and we did this with 32 different groups, those groups based on age and gender, and again within refugee and host communities. To put the social data into perspective, we also wanted to map the changes that had happened within these landscapes over the last 10 or so years. And we looked particularly at using Earth observation data from Sentinel-2, the Landsat program, and from synthetic aperture radar. We used different methods for each site, Changwali being much more tropical in nature, more evergreen and less prone to seasonal changes. We stuck with Sentinel-2 data and classification and vegetation index analysis. In the north, where we have much more savanna-style grassland and highly seasonal, we used a combination of classification approaches, but supported that with synthetic aperture radar. At both sites, we used Planet Labs 3-meter spatial resolution daily imagery to validate the findings in terms of land cover and in particular tree loss where we saw it. So the results of this work show that there's been significant environmental change at both refugee settlements. In and around Changwali, for example, the tree cover in the adjacent Bogoma forest, which is a forest reserve, has decreased by about 7.5%. And of those trees that remained in patches, then the mean patch size is reduced by 50%. So we see considerable landscape fragmentation, largely through encroachment around the edges of the forest rather than larger areas being cleared. In Bidi Bidi, we also see a significant loss of tree cover, with tree cover reduced by about 50%, and increased conversion of what the semi-natural habitat and savanna-style habitat that was there before to agricultural landscapes. This is partly because refugees in Uganda are given land to farm as well as humanitarian aid when they arrive. We also saw evidence of infrastructure and areas that were bare as a result of roads, as a result of clearance for housing. And as well as that, we also saw bush burning taking place on a regular basis. And again, overall, a much more fragmented landscape than what was there previously. And from this, we've derived a series of policy recommendations. Firstly, to incorporate local ecological, cultural and socio-economic conditions into settlement location planning, making sure that those ecological resources are present before the establishment of new refugee settlements. There also needs to be better access to sustainable fuelwood and timber sources, as well as alternative energy sources, as virtually 100% of the refugees and host communities in the region rely on wood for fuel. And this is something Lorraine will pick up shortly. Landscape restoration is also required in these areas, but we need to think about how to do it in a way that will maximise resources, perhaps stratifying the landscape according to the scale of the current impact, the socio-economic conditions and opportunities there are, and the ecosystem values in that particular location. The changes that we see in both settlements are clearly driven by a high dependency of refugee and host communities on natural resource-based livelihoods, which drive the need for fuelwood and timber collection, for bush burning and for charcoal production. But environmental change is often driven by wider political, economic factors beyond the immediate subsistence requirements of local communities. Commercial timber production for markets in the capital, Kampala, drives deforestation at both sites. Timber dealers from outside the area negotiate with local leaders, particularly in host and refugee communities, to undertake illegal logging. And locals and refugees are often employed to fell species of high economic value. Charcoal production is also carried out particularly in the dry season and is often a livelihood response to climate-related farming challenges in the area. And Ugandans from outside the settlement are also renting land in and around Changwali, for example, in order to grow high-value crops, often providing an income for refugees that live there. So from this, we see that our policy recommendations are around supporting alternatives for natural resource-based livelihoods where possible, and things like restricting export and demand for charcoal from outside of refugee hosting landscapes through education or through reducing demand and alternative technologies. I'll hand now to my colleague, Professor Lorraine van Blerk.
So moving on to look at creating sustainable livelihoods in our research and particularly the access to natural resources. The environmental changes that have been discussed and the related local policies and community dynamics mean that access to natural resources is a major challenge for communities, with the environmental issues transitioning into social issues. In Changwali, for example, the arrival of refugees has changed the way host communities interact with the forest, with increasing measures to limit forest access. And this includes restricted, although equal access to the forest for resource collection on designated days, which is enforced by government forest rangers and community forest officers. Although the cutting of live trees is forbidden, collection of resources can take place once a week. But these kind of rules that restrict livelihood options for refugees and host communities who weren't subject to it before does create social issues. So, for example, charcoal production is much less common in Changwali as a livelihood strategy when compared with our other field site of Bidi, which is likely to be a result of this policy access, which is in some ways protecting the forest environment and degradation within that area. But of course, that has implications for secure futures and livelihood futures. Both of the communities in Changwali and Bidi continue to require access to natural resources in order to have livelihood security. And this has resulted in increased violence, where there's been conflict between communities and forest rangers, and that's included gender-based violence. Communities complained about the heavy-handedness of government forest rangers who beat and rape, as we were told, and women have been particularly affected by this. So existing vulnerabilities are heightened as women fear to enter the forest to collect firewood and other natural resources, such as weaving materials that might be essential to generating income or other natural resources for sale. one elderly woman kind of indicates this quite well. She says, "We really fear going into that forest. We also fear the rangers, because once they find you there, they just beat you up. And for an old woman like me who has no energy to run out of the forest when the rangers start chasing people, I just don't go there completely." So that was Lucy in Changwali who made that comment. Although the social dynamics in Bidi Bidi are different, and also the environmental situation is very different, refugees are more dependent on host community legitimisation and interaction for access to the natural resources, which results in greater conflict between host and refugee communities. So, after exhausting forest resources around their village, refugees in Bidi Bidi now have to venture into host community areas to access trees. And again, that also leads to gender-based violence and other forms of violence. And as Brian notes, we're pushing out to areas where landlords were not paid something to compensate the natural resource to be used. Then we get the challenges that those people don't accept us to use their natural resources. And so here, refugees are often chased away or forced to trade their rations for access to these resources. Again, in both sites, natural resource use access issues impact individuals and households in different ways. So, of course, those households with fit, healthy members are able to make more trips and longer trips to forests or to other areas to collect enough firewood, perhaps for use or also for sale. But those households where the members are more elderly or perhaps in more vulnerable situations may be unable to do so. And so the time involved in firewood collection does have an impact on the secure futures of the communities. It leaves less time for household members to undertake other important livelihood tasks, including agriculture, income generation and housework, and this has resulted in some children missing school to collect firewood. So we have a few policy recommendations that are emerging from this aspect of the work, including needing to have greater environmental sensitisation on forest access, use, stewardship, and particularly gender-based violence. So we need to kind of have some training and greater engagement between communities. There's also the need for institutional arrangements to be more formalised and to enable refugees to collect resources in particular areas, particularly in Bidi Bidi. And of course, we need increased community participation in decision making and in the support of natural resource rights. So another aspect is around governance and programming, and this is an important role to play in the intersection between creating sustainable livelihoods and environmental change in refugee hosting landscapes. The extensive survey that we undertook clearly shows that despite degradation taking place, communities are acutely aware of the importance of trees, the importance of planting trees and maintaining them. However, tree planting schemes often fail due to funding structures that provide no support to communities for follow-up and maintenance. And at the same time, our in-depth interviews, particularly with key agencies, indicate that there is some duplication of effort among the implementing partners and a lack of whole system governance. This also rarely involves local communities in the process. And so, again, we have identified policy recommendations from our research that speak to these issues, particularly around mainstreaming environment in terms of cross-sectoral collaboration and improved coordination, and also targeting funding towards longer-term environmental initiatives that will operate over ecologically relevant timescales. And so, just to draw our presentation to a conclusion, I think this kind of novel approach that we've taken does illustrate the complex connections between environmental change and sustainable livelihoods in and around refugee settlements. The remotely sensed data clearly shows landscape fragmentation and tree cover reduction for both of the case study sites over the recent period of the intense refugee influx. And yet at the same time, our in-depth social science analysis reveals that these changes are partly driven by local population pressures and associated natural natural resource-based livelihoods, particularly household demand for fuel, wood and timber, because of a lack of alternative livelihoods. So the environmental changes occurring in these locations do present major livelihood challenges for refugee and host communities lacking access to natural resources. Although the dynamics of this does change depending on the sites and also depending on age, gender and other social markers. And so the analysis subsequently highlights that efforts to combat environmental degradation are hampered by governance challenges, and we need greater sectoral collaboration and coordination. But I think in particular, from a conceptual perspective, these learnings suggest a number of ways in which further exploration of environmental change, displacement, livelihood nexus, and the conceptualization of this is important for creating sustainable futures in and around refugee hosting landscapes. And just to say, we would like to thank all those involved in our research, our advisory board, our enumerators, translators, and all those who have supported the research, including the Funding Council, the Scottish Funding Council and the GCRF. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Van Blerk and Professor Cutler. Our second presentation today, we'll go ahead and move right through so that we'll have more time for discussion and Q&A at the end. Our second presentation is by Jamon van den Hoek, who is an assistant professor of geography and geospatial science at Oregon State University. His presentation is titled Mapping the Missing Millions, a critical assessment of geospatial data, environmental conditions, and climate change at the world's refugee camps.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamon van den Hoek. I'm an associate professor of geography at Oregon State University. Thanks very much for the invitation to present today. Really appreciate it and really looking forward to the conversation. The title of my talk is Mapping the Missing Millions, a critical assessment of geospatial data, settlement conditions, and climate change at the world's refugee camps. Sort of going to be going through those three themes in order. What I'm going to be sharing today is really a retrospective view of the project that we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years, which is a NASA Applied Sciences funded project on these kinds of themes. How do we understand refugee settlements and population relationships with the environment better through primarily satellite data analysis? Just as an overview, then there are 26 million refugees across 132 of the world's 195 countries. So this is truly a global phenomenon. Refugees are international migrants. This is a legal term, refugees. People who have been forcibly displaced from their home countries due to violence or persecution and have been granted protection, which is called asylum, under international law. Now, there's an exception to that, which is children. Last year, there were over 1 million refugee children born. So this is a phenomenon that is, unfortunately, the rate of refugee, the size of refugee population is growing each year and has done so for the past decade. We're not really seeing much of a change in this long-term trend. Many refugee camps today that exist today will likely still be occupied for decades to come. Not just because of the continual forced displacement of populations, but also the so-called warehousing policies that restrict refugee mobility in refugee hosting countries. Now, here's a map which is quite outdated, but it's the most updated map I could find, detailing the populations. This is about 15 years old at this point, of warehoused refugee populations in various countries around the world. These warehousing policies isolate refugees geographically, restrict livelihood and wage-seeking behavior, and really restrict overall movement. Mobility and migration are confined to the camp. Warehousing practices, for this reason, are a very good predictor of a protraction, which is to say how long refugees remain in camps, as well as dependence on host governments. And all in all, warehousing are overall rather dehumanizing processes. And people have likened warehoused conditions to carceral states, prison camps. Now, thinking about that timeline of protraction and long-term, then we know that extreme temperatures are all but guaranteed at in current refugee hosting regions, in particular across sub-Saharan Africa. This is an area of the world that is going to see some of the highest temperatures at any sort of horizon you could imagine in climate model forecasts. And we know that the pledges made at COP26 will not prevent 1.5 degree C or even 2 degrees C of warming globally. And we, of course, are expected to see more than each of those levels. If that's the global level, we're going to expect to see higher than that in sub-Saharan Africa, where we currently have about a third of the total refugee population, which I have kind of roughly demarcated here in the purple box. Well, how can we address these intersections between current refugees and climate change, between the Global Compact on Refugees, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and UNFCCC, three of the sort of together leading international compacts? None of these grapple with the effects of climate change on current refugee populations. This is an issue that is not really received nearly as much attention as it deserves. And that's what our work has been focused on. We're trying to develop the data, the geospatial data that are necessary to gauge current and anticipate future challenges related to climate vulnerability, societal integration, human health, and human rights. This Mapping the Missing Millions project, the title refers to the absence of refugees from censuses and from national censuses and from related development and monitoring efforts that are based on those censuses. So we've used this development sort of term to think about the absence of refugees in broader climate change awareness and policy frameworks. So we've asked questions like, do we really even know where refugee settlements are located globally in a systematic way? How are refugee settlements included in global human settlement data sets? Are they even detected by current satellite-based remote sensing mapping systems? And are current refugee settlements located in climatically marginal regions? Are these areas that are expected to see markedly higher exposure due to changes in precipitation or temperature? So on that first question, where are refugee camps? This is may sound like an odd question to ask. Anecdotally, of course, there's lots of accounts. We know that there are refugee camps there are refugees living in camps around the world, but we're interested in a systematic perspective. We want to know, if we go to a single or a database, can we accurately place refugee settlements on the map? So we looked at UNHCR data that's publicly available. We reviewed the locations as recorded by UNHCR of about 2,000 camp locations. And we used an interface called Collect Earth Online that allows us to go to every individual site and sort of assess the conditions at a given time and over time as well. So we developed our own protocol to do this. Some sites, like this one, were very easy to visually validate. Now, we don't know that that's a refugee site, but that is a settlement, to be sure. And so we said that looks good. There's a settlement there. This next site, next location, however, there's nothing there. That blue dot suggests from UNHCR there should be a settlement there. We don't see anything there, so we can't confirm that. That tended to be the case, the latter where we can't confirm it. Only 9% of UNHCR sites were actually located on a settlement, on a standalone settlement, not in an urban area, but on a standalone settlement. Now, about a half of these total sites were within the ballpark, 3 kilometers of at least one settlement, often many settlements. But again, we don't know which is which from this assessment. They're just around settlements. And so we would assume that these settlements that are nearby, one of them is a refugee settlement. About 10% of sites, there was nothing there. It was open vegetation. Some of them are open water. There was no suggestion of human settlement, roads or dwellings or anything. And then about a quarter of the sites, 28%, were surrounded by a broader urban area. And so their geoprecision couldn't be readily measured, right? They sort of integrate in with the urban fabric. But unexpectedly, most of those sites were not considered urban by UNHCR, which is a little bit perplexing. And that's also challenging because if we're trying to do automated stratification of rural and urban refugee settlements, these labels mean something. You would conduct assessments differently knowing if it's an urban area or rural, and yet we couldn't confidently do that. So these findings should give serious pause to any automated assessment of environmental conditions or change that you need that local level assessment. Don't do that using UNHCR data without validating it beforehand. What about the other question of this top-down view? Can we see refugee settlements in existing global human settlement products? Well, to look at these are all satellite-based products, and to look at this, we reviewed 4 different leading global. One of these is continental scale, Africa-wide, but the rest are global. These 4 products, the global human settlement layer, the high-resolution settlement layer, and the world settlement footprint, as well as Grid 3. Grid 3 is the Africa-wide product. It's a new product. These are based on different kinds of satellite imagery, but they all plug in to something else. They plug into, say, a population modeling effort where you don't have census data. And so you can see settlements, and so you disaggregate national or administrative level population data to these structures that you see in satellite data. Or they're used in development monitoring efforts, or they're used to cross-reference with nighttime lights, which are a good proxy in many conditions for economic productivity. Or climate hazard assessments, right? We know where, we know the number of dwellings, we know the number of people that might be there, so we can assess any sort of impact from climate hazard. So these are really an initial step towards a longer chain of analyses. That means that an absence of refugee settlements in these products may have cascading effects, right? Absence here means that they'll be absent from follow-on assessments. Well, that's what we found. Refugee settlement detection rates were much less than reported accuracies. In fact, we usually found a median detection rate across different ways. You can slice what does accuracy mean. You can look at a bunch of different ways. We looked at it 4 ways here, below 50% in most cases. Meanwhile, the stated accuracy is about 85 to 99% for these products. We even found that the oldest settlements, I failed to mention that we're studying these with 30 settlements in Uganda, where we have really good ancillary data. The oldest settlements that we looked at here were poorly detected despite being around for decades, right? So these are some of the most well-established sites, and yet they're still absent from these products. This kind of absence just compounds the overarching lack of data on refugees and their long-term settlements. It's very worrisome. What about our third question? Climatic marginalization. Are refugee settlements, do they experience or will they experience distinct climatic exposure compared to other settlements in the area? Well, we looked at current and future precipitation and temperature at refugee settlements. Both of these are sort of core variables that are relevant for outmigration, for agricultural productivity and loss therein with climate hazards. Of course, physiological exposure, heat conditions with temperature, very important. So we looked at this at refugee settlements and a sample of non-refugee sites in border regions of refugee hosting countries. So we looked at current annual precipitation. We looked at the future change in annual precipitation, and we looked at the future change in near surface air temperature. Now, I should say that all of these change data are based on the high-end RCP 8.5 scenario. However, we are currently tracking globally towards that scenario. So we chose this, at least for illustration here today. Right, we're looking at the pessimistic outlook. With this model scenario, we have globally, refugee settlements currently have higher annual precipitation. You can see the distributions here, refugee settlement shown in red, there are control sites, these non-refugee, these otherwise viable sites where refugee settlements could have been established, for example, lower precipitation in this scenario. Refugee settlements are expected to have a larger increase of precipitation overall, though it's not quite as marked as the last one. You can see this is positive and negative, so many sites expected to see increase, other sites expected to see loss. And similarly, temperature, there may not be that much of a difference. However, the values are well above 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, of course, under this high emission scenario. Now, nationally, this splits out very differently. We see quite distinct differences country to country. So in Turkey, currently home to about 4 million refugees, most of which are from Syria, we see the camps in Turkey having very high current precipitation compared to non-camp sites. Expected to see less precipitation in the future, but higher temperatures, right, on the right-hand side. Somewhat of a similar story in Pakistan, which is home to about 1.5 million Afghan refugees. Current precipitation, there's more precipitation at refugee camps, less of a precipitation, actually a loss in precipitation going forward. Whereas we see other sites, we see much higher precipitation, and then future temperature change, much higher temperatures at these refugee sites in Pakistan. In Uganda, a different story again. We see a little bit less stark difference overall, somewhat similar in terms of the central tendencies of current precipitation and future precipitation, and a very broad distribution of future temperature changes as well that are rather similar. So suffice it to say, it really varies country to country to country, and we need to be able to account for that. We need to know country level and site level climate exposure needs. And with this approach, we can indeed look at individual sites, identify individual settlements that are exceptionally exposed compared, or marginalized rather, compared to other sites. So many of these settlements existing today will be here in 2050, 2070, through whatever climate change horizon we're interested in. We as researchers must be aware of the data limitations affecting multi-country, multi-site research on climate change impacts. This is a new kind of direction, and we really have to do this well. So we need to understand biases and limitations of existing data. Research, I've been really pleased to see kind of unsiloing, untethering from disciplinary domains to better address problems at the intersection of humanitarianism, land use, development, climate change. The list really goes on. There's so many intersectional challenges here. That trend, I think, must continue. Policy frameworks must explicitly address these long-term challenges that span not just the climate exposure, but economic. What happens when host communities migrate away, right? These are looming challenges that we really have very little capability to start really addressing in terms of policy right now. And of course, dehumanizing warehousing policies that have the potential to trap refugees in uninhabitable settlements must end, as does the civil conflict that causes forced displacement in the first place. Thank you so much for the time. I know I went over about a minute. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this and other things we're speaking about today. Thanks very much for the time.
Dr. Van den Hoek, thank you so much for your presentation. We'll continue with our final presentation, which is by Dr. Alark Saxena, Assistant Professor of Forestry at Northern Arizona University, and Dr. Anwesha Dutta, who is a Senior Researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Norway. Their presentation is titled Displacement and the Environment, Considering Settlements as Socio-Ecological Systems.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alark Saxena, and I'm an Assistant Professor of Human Dimensions of Forestry at the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University. On behalf of our project team, I'm happy to introduce our recently awarded and ongoing research project titled Prioritizing the Displacement Environment Nexus, Refugee and Internal Displaced People Settlements as Socio-Ecological Systems. This project is led by PI Anwesha Dutta and me as the co-PI. The project is funded by NorGlobal and is hosted by the Christian Michelsen Institute in collaboration with Northern Arizona University and other field partners. Senior personnel of this project include Antonio De Lauri, Patrick Jans, Alder Keleman Saxena, and Hannah Gishweski. Now, to set the context for this project, we are living in a time of unprecedented environmental degradation induced by human activities, also referred to as the Anthropocene. Science has warned us that inability to stop these changes will create irreversible and catastrophic futures for vulnerable communities across the world. Environmental degradation, intermingled with socio-political and economic shifts, has caused and is causing displacement of vulnerable communities around the world. Climate change will exacerbate these conditions. These displacements have long-term environmental implications. Focusing on environmental degradation and stopping them will reduce humanitarian disasters, while focusing on environmental issues within refugee settlements will increase the everyday coping and well-being of vulnerable refugee and IDP communities. From a policy perspective, humanitarian organizations and government alike continue to position environmental protection as a policy objective distinct from humanitarian assistance, posing a challenge both for theory and practice. From a research perspective, the fields of refugee and migration studies are inherently multidisciplinary, given the array of factors that are inherent in these areas of work. Yet, a review of Oxford Handbook Refugee and Forced Migration Studies reveals that the inclusion of inter- and multidisciplinary perspectives remains largely confined to humanistic and social science disciplines, example, politics, law, anthropology, geography, and sociology. The role of environment and ecology has featured in refugee humanitarian studies since the 1980s, including the coinage of term environmental refugees. However, a more recent review of field by Peugeot et al. 2018, drawing on over 50 years of studies on climate change and human migration, examined how nature is being included in migration and refugee studies. The literature highlights the theoretical and conceptual disjuncture associated with studying the environment as an integral part of refugee systems. Despite the calls for research on this topic, very little research exists on processes linking refugees and internally displaced personnel to the environment in new settlements. Needs have been identified early on. Blerk in 1994 noted that there was yet to be a long-term study of a place, that is, before, during, and after refugee settlement. Surprisingly, 2 decades plus, such a study is yet to be undertaken systematically. More recently, Blerk 2020, observing the state of refugee studies, suggested the need for comparative approaches, interdisciplinary perspectives, and multi-level analysis, while accounting for intergenerational aspects of migration and durable solutions. Calls from within the refugee studies, example, Grainer et al. 2015, have been made to embrace the socio-ecological premise that human and natural systems are intimately connected, forming complex and reciprocal feedbacks. Authors argue that a convergence between migration concepts and socio-ecological approaches will create opportunities for taking biophysical conditions surrounding migrants and migration seriously, while also going beyond simple environmentally determinist models. Our project draws on research linking the natural and social sciences, specifically the study of socio-ecological systems, and a spatially explicit derivative of this field, the study of socio-ecological landscapes. The proposed research objectives are to develop and pilot a novel methodology for conceptualizing and assessing refugee and IDP settlements as nested, complex, and adaptive socio-ecological systems, to collect spatial, historical, and ethnographic data on linkages between land cover, land use change, and human well-being, that is, as we think, livelihoods and health, and to integrate and analyze the above collected data with a framework derived from the theory of adaptive change, which I'll discuss in the subsequent slides, with the intent of identifying key adaptive phases and processes that influence environmental sustainability and human well-being. And finally, to undertake a prospective or forward-looking assessment of likely next adaptive phases and scenarios in order to provide policy guidance to humanitarian agencies. These are our research questions that the project tackles. What are the long-term land cover and land use change, LCLUC, associated with refugee and IDP settlements? What key patterns in well-being have characterized the experience of refugee and IDPs related to land cover land use change? What major events have influenced the trajectories of land cover land use change and refugee IDP well-being? And finally, how have institutions influenced these relationships which link refugee IDPs to the surrounding landscape, and with what effect? We will conduct our research in two sites. The first in Kabul, Afghanistan, where the fall of Taliban government in 2001 led to a rapid increase in returning refugees population from Pakistan and Iran. Kabul grew from 1.5 million people in 2001 to 4.2 million people today. There are more than 52 IDP camps hosting more than 2 million people in Kabul. This has created long-term land use challenges. Poor infrastructure, poor governance, and health has led to poor health outcomes for IDP communities. On the other hand, the Tibetan settlements were established in 1960 when Tibetans took refuge in India following the persecution by China. Bailakuppe in Karnataka in southern India is one of the largest and oldest refugee settlements, and it is situated in an elephant corridor and next to a tiger reserve. The region has seen a lot of human-animal conflict and more recently has faced severe droughts. Anwesha will reflect on her recent visit to Bailakuppe in subsequent slides. Now a bit about the theoretical approach of our research project. We consider refugee and IDP settlements as nested social ecological systems. Now, real-world systems consist of both social and ecological components, which are dynamic, that is changing over time, complex, that is composed of multiple interacting parts, and adaptive, that is responsive to novel conditions and inputs. Localized social ecological systems, such as refugee IDP settlements, are nested within larger regional and global systems, responding to cross-scalar influences from these systems. We conceptualize that refugee and IDP settlements, like other real-world settlements, undergo different adaptive phases, as identified through theory of adaptive change and shown in the diagram below. The adaptive phases include growth, exploitation, conservation phase, and release phase. Learning about these adaptive phases can allow us to frame what different refugee and IDP settlements have gone through and what may lie ahead. Through the heuristics of nested adaptive cycles, the theory of adaptive change framework enables interdisciplinary analysis of relationships between humans and natural systems in context of environmental and socio-political shifts over time. Formulated through the different phases, theory of adaptive change also incorporates both stability and transformation, helping explain why certain periods in a system were more stable than the others, even while the forces of stabilization and destabilization observed may be similar in nature. Thus, a theory of adaptive change framework allows for comparing commonalities across systems without flattening specific local processes. Some other frameworks that we'd like to use for creating a more integrated approach is the sustainable livelihood framework, where households with access to different sets of capitals develop their own livelihood strategies in an integrated way. And then the second framework that we like to use is the One Health framework, where we look at the health of environment, animal health, and human health in an integrated way to develop a better idea of well-being. Finally, these are the methods that we plan to deploy. For understanding land cover and land use change, we will be using remote sensing, which will be integrated with use of oral histories and ethnographic research in the field. We'll be doing livelihood surveys, and we will use all of this data in an integrated way through the theory of adaptive change. And further, we will use some SWOT analysis to help understand the weakness and threats and create scenarios, and then we'll be able to use these to help understand what may happen in the future. As we have come to realize, we have a very ambitious agenda through this research project. Some of the novel aspects of the project are the conceptualization of refugee and IDP settlements as integrated, nested, complex, adaptive, social-ecological systems. This is also the first project to use theory of adaptive change on refugee social-ecological systems to understand their adaptive phases. We couple remote sensing work with rich historical and ethnographic work, and we develop scenarios that are appropriate for refugee social-ecological systems. And finally, we create through this research and methods a synergy between increased well-being of displaced refugee populations and environmental sustainability. I stop here, and now Anwesha will discuss her recent research trip to Blerk in India. I thank you for your attention.
Hi, so I will now talk about the recent empirical findings that I had when I visited 3 Tibetan settlements in India. On my screen, you have a map that shows the different Tibetan settlements in South Asia. We have been working, or our proposed project takes place in the 3 settlements in Karnataka in southern India. These are part of the Western Ghats, and also important to mention is that these settlements are next to a tiger reserve, at least 2 of them. So what I will do in this presentation is walk you through a brief history of these settlements. I will focus on a story of ecological resilience, and most of it will be focused on ecology and ecological or environmental adaptation with a focus on agriculture. So the 2 settlements I visited were Kollegal and the Blerk settlements. This is the entrance to the Blerk settlement. This settlement has been around since the 1960s. It's one of the oldest settlements that there is. Most of the people there are the ones who remain, because it's important to bear in mind that a majority of the Tibetans have actually left India and they live outside of India, and that mostly in European and American countries, and that the ones who are in the settlement, especially in Blerk, either engage in commercial activities, so tourism-related activities, selling tangsa art, restaurants, cafes, and so on, or agriculture. This is the Kollegal settlement, which is a more remote settlement in the Western Ghats, and here primarily people engage in agriculture. And when I say agriculture, I mean maize. So what I will run you through is some snippets of the interviews that I have had and the kind of conversations I have gathered when I have asked questions related to the kind of agrarian changes, cropping patterns, weather events in the settlement. So the age group that I spoke to ranged from 16 to 92. And some of the oldest settlers, when I interviewed them, they said that when they first set foot in Karnataka, in this area, it was dense forest. So basically close to 6,000 acres of evergreen forest land was cleared to and was turned then into these settlements. Out of this, there was a very clear mandate there that per household, how many acres of land they would get. So currently, each household has about 5 acres of agricultural land in Kollegal. So what they said to me is that when they first set foot in the settlement, all that was familiar to them was the sky above and ground below. We have to bear in mind that these are people who came with the Dalai Lama in 1959, walking mostly from Tibet through Nepal, making their way to northern India in Himachal Pradesh, where they worked as construction workers on road construction for a few years before the Indian government offered land in Karnataka, and they were sent here. So when they cleared the land clearance was often done together with the Indian government. There was an NGO that got the contract, and some of the Tibetans then were employed as laborers. They got 2 rupees a day, which is close to probably 2 cents that they got, and there was a lot of aid that came to them in forms of food or drinks or oil, but most of it was quite unfamiliar, is what they talk about. Then they started growing maize, and they continued to do monocropping. So when you look at the Western Ghats, the Tibetan settlements are largely monocropping. And there are many reasons to this. One of them being that they can get crop insurance in case of a bad year or market fluctuation, and that the seeds are supplied through the cooperative society. So there's a Tibetan cooperative society that mainly is responsible for providing seed and also taking the finished produce and matching the prices. And that does not really cover the other cash crops, for example, beetroot, ginger, garlic, potatoes. Of late, there have been instances of growing silver oak. Silver oak is a high value timber, which they said they went on an expedition around the area, and they saw some Kannadigas, the local population, growing silver oak. So they started doing silver oak plantation, and on that they grow black and white pepper. But the cooperative society actually mostly focuses on maize, and they are also entitled to crop insurance from the Indian government, but in the Kollegal settlement. There is a problem of human-wildlife conflict, mainly from elephants and wild boars. And so very recently, just 1 year ago, an Australian company started with a vetiver crop. Vetiver is a grass which goes 4 feet into the soil, and so it's safe from depredation. They do not interact as much with the forest department, and of late they have stopped having cattle, especially in mid-80s when the forest area around them got converted into a tiger reserve, and they no longer had rights to take their cattle there. This is again corn cultivation. One of the important phases that this settlement has gone through is that they've gone through the phase of humanitarian aid, as we would qualify. So if you can see, this is a building that used to be part of was donated by the European Union, but now they go on to build more of these artistry structures. The focus really was on understanding everyday forms of socio-ecological lives in exile, and it totally seemed to be a story of resilience, with many of them trying to do organic cropping, which was once a mandate, but it was changed because of changes in governance. There's also a very strong focus on preservation of culture and heritage. They also do banana cropping, but then they don't get the help of the cooperative society. So in some ways, the Tibetans, although being one of the most politically persecuted and marginal communities, have shown great resilience in terms of ecological adaptation. Of course, we need to go back, and this is a 4 years project, and we need to actually map these adaptive phrases and also do a political ecology of how these decisions of adaptation have been made. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saxena and Dr. Dutta. We will now transition to comments by our discussant, Dr. Ilan Kelman. Just to give a brief introduction, Dr. Kelman is Professor of Disasters and Health at University College London in England, and a Professor too at the University of Agder, Kristiansand, Norway. His overall research interest is linking disasters and health, including the integration of climate change into disaster research and health research. This covers 3 main areas. First, disaster diplomacy and health diplomacy. Second, island sustainability involving safe and healthy communities in isolated locations. And third, risk education for health and disasters. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelman, for being here today, and let me turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, and so exciting to see all these wonderful, deep, and such pertinent research projects, not just through the presentations, but also what they're going to achieve for science, but more to the point, science for society. So the one on Uganda, absolutely challenged narratives. People will look at the immediate and say, well, the refugees are there destroying the landscape, but as they're evidencing, it's often externally driven by wider forces, and the refugees, the people right there, are simply trapped in their own situation without much choice. This is so amply illustrated by the work they did in terms of using mixed methods, which is a lesson to us all, to work across disciplines, across methods, and across data types. which really was demonstrated through their brilliant exposition of the local aspects, but then scaling up and thinking beyond that particular context in order to connect the topics, connect the data, connect the methods. It is so important that we are honest and straightforward and evidenced in terms of identifying who is driving environmental changes, and at all scales, that one refugee picking up firewood right through to the global changes we are going through. It just shows how much local action and involving everyone, those who are right on site and far away, can actually have a major influence, not just for a single refugee settlement, but of course for the entire country, in this case, Uganda. Because sometimes local action or local interests may not lead to the best outcome. We saw, they explained how there was conflict, violence, and disenchantment through conflicting local needs. And this led to their very constructive, very positive policy recommendations moving forward, which then leads to my question. At what point do we use our science to move to more strident responses, such as accusations, blame, and punishment? When we think of the second presentation, the mapping, again, such powerful lessons. We cannot get trapped in our own frames of mind or our own boxes or just the standard way of doing it. These clearly, in what was presented, more data do not necessarily mean better analysis, simply because of what was missing. What the data did not present, what we did not see, what we could not consider. This demonstrates, again, thinking across data, across disciplines, across boundaries, and doing comparisons, critical comparisons, critiquing comparisons, to consider similarities and differences in the data streams we have, and of course, the data streams we do not have. It also helps to avoid getting entirely boxed in, to be thinking, yes, of course, we do have to go decades into the future, think about global climate change as we've done. But from Uganda, there are also many other environmental changes, much more localized and much more imminent. And this, of course, could be other environmental variables or environmental hazards, such as earthquakes, localized landslides, localized floods, or volcanic eruptions. But if we are trying to get the powerful policy recommendations which we all seek, then it really shows the challenges of identifying and tracking refugees. It's not just that the camps were not directly there in terms of where they were assumed to be sited. It wasn't just missing data. It's the fact that we know that so many just disperse. They may have the funds to self-settle. They may be with friends or families or somehow work out their own approaches away from these actual settlements. And I think the most terrifying aspect that came from this presentation was, oh yeah, the camps will be there in 2050, 2070. Yeah, we know this is a reality. But think about that, going to someone and saying, yeah, you're a refugee for the next 2 generations, which is why this work is needed and why we do have to ensure that they don't suffer any more than they already have suffered. Which leads to my question. The work which was done, can that lead to operational real-time application to help people in need directly from environmental hazards or perhaps other forms of hazards such as conflict and violence? Some of this may emerge from the third presentation. And the real fascinating part of what was here is actually the terminology, but really connecting it to reality, people's experiences, and not losing track of the fact that they are human beings. So this phrase I've always found peculiar, social ecological systems or socio-ecological systems or socio-environmental, I mean, there's a whole bunch of variations, but the definition makes sense. Human and natural systems are intimately connected, forming complex and reciprocal feedbacks. Well, yeah, of course. Any refugee knows this. Any host in the area knows this, because this is reality. In a sense, we have to think, well, is there any settlement, refugee or otherwise, which is not social ecological? Or put another way, if we just call it reality, rather than the complex phrase, does it make any difference? And same with adaptive change. Adaptation by definition is change. Change by definition requires adaptation. So I'm a fairly simple guy. Why use two words when we could use one? And also, again, thinking about the fact that we are unfortunately projecting not only our impacts on the globe, but also what individuals are experiencing in the camps out to 2050, out to 2070, which means we're talking generations and lifetimes. By definition, this is always complex. I've yet to meet someone who is not adaptive. Nothing is constant, nothing is simple. So using the modifiers, using many words to just say, well, this is people, this is reality. Again, we need to think about our roles as academics and how we communicate, how we explain. Of course, the big one is the R word, resilience, where there's now 15 years of literature explaining all the detriments of it and how resilience actually can be counterproductive. So when we try to translate it, when we try to apply in different contexts, it's challenging. And resilience is often something which actually causes the problems which people are experiencing day to day. We can contrast that with the wonderful words that the presentation used, such as well-being and livelihoods. And of course, sustainability was in there, which has its problems, but at least we can grab it and say we are trying to sustain into the future and sustain to help people. So well-being, health, livelihoods, this tends to be what people seek, what they want. It's a chance to enjoy life, to be fulfilled in safe situations with friends, families, and opportunities. And this is the power of the case studies which have been selected, and all credit to the researchers for choosing not easy ones, but ones which unfortunately epitomize many of our troubles today, which leads to my question to them. What about Afghanistan now? How is your project, how is your research going to be affected? What adaptive changes will you use given the really quick transition in Afghanistan and a rather bleak future in many ways? The fundamental thread bringing them all together is perhaps the fact that we are in a situation of doing long-term decision-making and planning for a situation which should be short-term. The whole point of asylum, of refugees, is that it's temporary. The key phrase we prefer or is used is durable solutions. And yet we see how frequently durability, sustainability is completely missing because they are there for lifetimes. The refugee children and grandchildren referred to in the second presentation. So if we are talking about sustainable futures, again, great buzzwords, if we are trying to support people in need and in trouble, how do we ensure that our research really gets the policymakers and decision makers to say, look what we're doing to these human beings. Look what we are doing to people who deserve so much more. And it really shows that what we are trying to do as researchers, our responsibility, our duty, is really to get beyond the headlines, get beyond the echo chamber of social media, get beyond a lot of the ideological rhetoric, and really point out that this key phrase, which came out particularly in the first presentation, but was all through all three, is evidence-based research to inform policy and practice. But not just to inform policy and practice, to inform human beings. As I said, our science is for society. Our science should be for people. So how can we ensure that all this exciting, creative, innovative, wonderful research ends up with the fundament of treating people as people? That yes, we talk about refugees and IDPs and hosts and people in the community and rangers. We're talking about millions of people. It is just staggering how many people have been forced from their homes and how many end up crossing international borders when all they want is to go back to their own country, their own people, and have, from the third presentation, have well-being and have livelihoods, have a good life. And it is too often, too much, politics which precludes them doing so. So thank you so much to the three projects. Thank you so much to everyone on this call for being able to ensure that we can do better, particularly using science to produce that evidence basis. Thank you.
Dr. Kelman, thank you so much for those comments and for your careful and thorough thinking through of the presentations for today. At the moment, we have just a few more minutes for this part of the webinar. So I would actually like to ask the presenters to come back to some of the questions that Dr. Kelman has posed. And I think if we have to choose only one, which may be the case due to the limitations of time, I think the question that Dr. Kelman posed following the first presentation about I'm going to rephrase this a little bit, but about the benefits and drawbacks of this kind of research and drawing attention to environmental processes and sometimes environmental degradation that happens in and around refugee settlements or IDP settlements. Where the line falls between science that can help and science that can then lead to furthering of processes of blame and punishment toward either refugee populations or host populations nearby who may be struggling equally as much in terms of livelihoods, even if they have not been displaced from their homes. This is something that I know all of our panelists have thought very carefully about, so I wanted to give you the chance to respond to that prompt, perhaps starting with Dr. Cutler and Dr. Van Blerk.
Thanks, Alder, for rephrasing that. And I think that's why we were really keen to blend the kind of diverse methodologies that we did and not just take a remote sensing environmental change perspective, looking at the changes to the environment and the kind of impacts that large numbers of refugees and host communities are having in terms of the engagement with the landscape. And we were also deeply concerned with exploring how these large numbers of people can have sustainable livelihoods over the long term, given that much of the displacement is protected in the settlements that we're working in. So we very much saw this as a three-way connection, both between the local participants, the refugees and host communities, as well as the environment itself and the policy community. And so we spent 18 months discussing with the policy community in terms of how we can make the livelihoods for these people sustainable over the long term. Do you want to come in?
Well, just to echo that, it was about, to some extent, challenging this narrative. You even see in UNHCR literature that it's refugees driving the degradation, and the way we wanted to, by blending the remote sensing and the social science, was to come up with a much more nuanced and informed view that was spatially explicit as well between the two sites, to come up with sort of genuine insight that would perhaps remove us from this rather blanket narrative of it's just refugees and highlighting those areas, and it was to try and to actually challenge some of that. And I think this is where the interdisciplinarity of our project has really come to the fore in trying to address that.
Thanks to both of you for those responses. And I just want to highlight something that to me seems really key from what you've said, which is that in addition to reading across policy literature, you were involving policymakers in conversation about the research, not with the final report, but rather early on in the process when you were developing policy recommendations. And that to me is something that I think is quite different from many projects that are undertaken. So it bears highlighting and restating. I wonder if Dr. Van den Hoek or Dr. Saxena and Dutta would like to respond to that same prompt.
I can reply briefly. Yeah, I really appreciate the question from Dr. Kelman and totally agree with Lorraine and Mark's perspectives. The things that come to mind immediately to me are the Rohingya crisis right now, which has been broadly seen as a narrative of blame. In academic literature, it's a little bit mixed, but it's difficult not to read academic studies of deforestation and land cover change in Cox's Bazar and Kutupalong and not see it as having a blaming component. That tone always seems to be there. This direct causation, right? The agency over land use somehow is an indicator of the freedom to make other decisions. that doesn't exist in some of these contexts, right? These are forcibly displaced from their home, and they're often forcibly settled into refugee camps. They have no, in many cases, no other means of collecting something as basic as fuel wood to boil water. The second thing that comes to mind is from a geospatial perspective, thinking about say a multi-site or multi-country analysis, we can find lots of cases where refugee settlements show negligible, refugee communities, I should say, show negligible impact on the landscape. Outside of the very obvious change of new dwellings, new structures, perhaps new roadways, maybe there's no deforestation. That may not be a good sign. That may be an indicator of a very restrictive warehousing policy that doesn't let refugees leave the camp boundary. So there's a counterfactual there that must be taken into account when you look at multiple contexts, which is why the work that all the other presenters are doing, these really rich bottom-up perspectives that are fused with top-down perspectives, that's how you have to do that, to pull out those unique circumstances and understand what your detection, your empirical data actually mean in the social context or policy context. The last thing I'll say is the continued focus on deforestation. It's important, yes. If you go back in the literature, this is what's mainly been done since the mid-'80s on refugee-environment relationships. There's relatively new research on water resource use, primarily led by, not primarily, but centrally led by Hadi Jafar. There is other work on agricultural cultivation led by Catherine Nakalembe and other researchers. There are other aspects of the environment that refugees interact with that we can see from space, that we can see on the ground through participatory mapping, other than deforestation. Deforestation has been a sort of go-to, in a sense, the sort of common environmental indicator of change, in part because it's relatively easy to detect deforestation compared to agricultural cultivation, compared to groundwater withdrawals, right? Much more challenging from a remote sensing perspective. Nothing to do, this is not a constraint that only refugee environment researchers have. Remote sensing geospatial literature at large, this is a predominant focus, in part because it's just easier to do that. Satellites are better at detecting big trees that stand out from the landscape. So there are a couple of intersections there, but the comment is completely agreed, and looking forward to seeing how we can move on to more grounded perspectives on other kinds of environment relationships.
Thank you so much for those comments. I'm looking at our time. I had hoped to open the mic also for our third set of presenters to respond to this question, but I have a feeling this may be a thread that will run through the second part of our panel as well. So in the interest of time, I think it may be a good time to close this session. We'll go ahead and take maybe a 3 to 5 minute break before starting our second session, but we'll try not to get too far behind our schedule. And I wanted to give one more big thank you to all of the presenters in this session for sharing the findings and the conceptualization behind their projects, and also to Dr. Kelman for his thoughtful and insightful comments. I look forward to continuing in just a few minutes.
Yes, so I think we can continue. Welcome everyone to the next panel. My name is Antonio De Lauri, and I am the director of the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies that today is sponsoring this important event. So the next panel will have 4 speakers. I will now briefly introduce them, whom we thank very much for being here today with us. Madeline Garlick is Chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice Section in the Division of International Protection at UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. In 2018, she was Assistant Representative for Protection for UNHCR in Iraq, and she was previously responsible for UNHCR's liaison to the EU institutions. She has served with the UN in Cyprus and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She teaches in Science Po and at the Refugee Studies Center in Oxford, and she is qualified as a barrister and solicitor in Victoria, Australia. Then we have with us Vanessa Lawrence, who is working internationally as a senior advisor to governments, intergovernmental organizations, including the World Bank and large private sector organizations. She holds a number of non-executive board positions, including at the Ilan Turing Institute for Data Science and AI, and the Satellite Applications Catapult. She's on the advisory board of the Walker Institute, the interdisciplinary research institute supporting the development of climate resilient societies, and is the patron of MAP Action, the humanitarian mapping charity. She is also a trustee of the Royal Geographical Society as an adjunct professor at the University of Southampton. With us, we also have Beza Tesfaye, who is the Director of Research and Learning for Migration and Climate Change at the Mercy Corps, and a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her work focuses on using evidence to inform foreign aid programs, policies, and investments. She has published extensively based on her research in Niger, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, El Salvador, Kenya, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. Finally, Arjit Singh is the final panelist today, is a global expert on the issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation. He has supported countries across the world on tackling climate change, coordinating emergency response and disaster resilience programs. He is a senior advisor at the Climate Action Network International and provides strategic advice to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. He is a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. So thank you all again for being here today with us. I would start by giving immediately the floor to Madeline Garlick for her short reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lauri, and let me thank the organizers for bringing us together for this event today, and to all of the participants. We've already heard some fascinating insights, which will certainly be the basis for some excellent discussion. I'd like to turn to the first question that was put to us as panelists, namely what the projections of climate change and forced displacement mean for our agency or field of work. And I can affirm that this is already recognized as a very central challenge for the United Nations as a whole and for UNHCR as part of that. The Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Guterres, previously the High Commissioner for Refugees, stated recently that the climate emergency is a code red for humanity and underlined the need for all of us to be doing more to undertake urgent action across the UN system as well as with partners. High Commissioner Grandi, who's the current High Commissioner for Refugees, has referred to the climate emergency as one of the major challenges facing the organization in the coming years. The current projections and available data, I think that some of which we've heard today, really show us that this needs to be a continuing and growing focus of our work in years to come. And there's a few concrete reasons for that, and I'll just mention two. Firstly, we see already in UNHCR's work that climate change and its adverse effects are already affecting refugees in major ways. Some 90% of refugees under UNHCR's mandate, which are estimated to number some 21 million at the beginning of this year, originate from countries that are the most vulnerable to climate change. And many of these are least ready to adapt to its impact in ways that could make return in safety and dignity, which is one of the durable solutions which we work to achieve, increasingly challenging. Moreover, we see that some 70% of the world's refugees are being hosted in countries that are particularly impacted by the effects of climate change, which speaks to some of the findings of the research that was mentioned before the break and really underlines the importance of further work on analysing conditions in those countries and what can be done to address them. As a second major factor for us in our work, we see that climate change can in and of itself be part of the phenomena which compel people to move. It's evident that climate change intensifies existing vulnerabilities of people in many parts of the world. Extreme weather events, environmental degradation, and social, economic, and political factors often interact. So we see heightened vulnerabilities that intersect with other risk factors, including natural hazards, conflict, socio-economic conditions, and various forms of discrimination. And so these factors together can often force people to flee their homes, most often within their own countries, but in many situations also across borders. meaning that they may go abroad to seek protection, also against being sent back to face persecution, violence, and other life-threatening situations or conditions. So against this background, UNHCR has developed a strategic framework on climate action with 3 pillars: one on legal and normative aspects of the protection of people who are displaced in this context, which I'll refer to in a minute; a second pillar, an operational one, on prevention, on mitigation, on disaster risk reduction and resilience building with respect to refugees, some of which deals directly with some of the issues that were also highlighted in research before the break; and a third one on seeking to green UNHCR's own operation and reduce our own unacceptably large carbon footprint. So my section in UNHCR, the Protection Policy and Legal Advice part, leads the first of those pillars on legal and normative aspects. And as part of this, and also pursuant to HCR's mandate and supervisory role for the implementation of international refugee instruments, we issued in October last year a set of legal considerations regarding claims for international protection made in the context of the adverse effects of climate change and disasters. And this is a publicly available document, the link to which I'll put in the chat shortly. But to sum briefly, this guidance aims to provide guidance to states and other partners on the interpretation and application of international refugee and human rights law, where it is relevant in the context of displacement situations associated with climate change impacts and disasters. And this seeks to highlight that in some specific circumstances, refugee and human rights law may apply, including the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, as well as regional refugee and human rights instruments, which may give rise to a right to international protection and an obligation correspondingly on states to grant refugee status or asylum. Now, I should make clear, UNHCR does not use the term climate refugees, which is not a part of international law, but we do seek to underline that the definition of a refugee under international law, that is, a person who flees who has a well-founded fear of persecution related to reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group or political opinion, can apply in certain circumstances, notably where the effects of climate change and disaster may interact with conflict, violence, or persecution. The paper doesn't seek to expand the international legal definition of a refugee, but it does seek to provide guidance on the ways in which it should be correctly interpreted in modern context, where we see climate change interacting with such circumstances as conflict and violence, and so in situations in which climate change and disaster may exacerbate or even cause tensions between community, conflict, violence, and discrimination in ways in which against which states may be unwilling or unable to protect. We also underlined that the regional refugee instruments, including notably the 1969 OAU Convention governing specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa, as well as the 1984 Cartagena Declaration adopted by many Latin American countries, may also apply with their broader definitions of a refugee, which include people who are forced to flee events seriously disturbing public order, which is precisely the situation we may see arising in some situations of disaster and climate change. So in sum, UNHCR sees very clearly the need for us to continue to engage operationally and to deal with the challenges around refugee settlements and ensuring that refugees can be helped to build their own resilience and that of the communities in which they are hosted. But we also see the continuing need to engage with states to discuss their obligations, including to provide protection to refugees who may need it, including as a result of phenomena linked to disasters and climate change. And this work isn't work we can do alone. In order to be effective, we really underline the importance of working in partnership, which means we need to work with state authorities, but also advocates and civil society, as well as academic experts across many disciplines. And therefore, we're very interested to talk to participants here about their insights and to encourage them to continue to do work on relevant questions in this field. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot for starting this panel with a good glimpse of what UNHCR is doing on the field. So I'll now give the floor to Vanessa Lawrence, please.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for a fascinating set of talks that we've already heard. I'd like to address my comments via 3 different angles, if I may. Firstly, from the role of Map Action, which is a humanitarian charity that is part of the first responder group for mapping around the world whenever there's a humanitarian or kind of natural crisis. Secondly, through an organization called ALSIS that partners with the UN and the World Bank on a very regular basis. And they work always in very fragile environments. And then finally, through the Walker Institute, which I'm also involved in, which supports the development of climate resilient societies. So very much Map Action is taking very much a role of repositioning itself to focus more on climate change. And they're working towards many new partnerships, very much looking at the anticipatory action to ensure they're better prepared when there is an emergency and a humanitarian need. So one of the things in geospatial and Earth observation that's so important is data preparedness. And for each and every country, the UN, particularly the United Nations Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management, UNGGIM, has recognized that having a framework of data called foundational data available instantly is a very good idea. And so Map Action's working on a data scramble at the moment for 40 countries. They've already done 20 this year, and they will get to 40 by the end of next year. Basically looking at the most vulnerable areas and thinking, what can they do? They're also very much doing work on urban settings and thinking about how can they understand the vulnerability for future program planning, disaster risk reduction, and also trying to get senior ministerial understanding of the advocacy that's required. And then very much using data science to forecast upcoming emergencies, working with the Centre for Humanitarian Data to do this by seconding a member of their team, and also working with universities such as Edinburgh and NGOs to look at this. Now, turning to ALSIS, they have worked extensively in Afghanistan, in Syria, and for instance, they've done a lot of work when looking at the drought, for instance, in northern Afghanistan, comparing the work between 2018 and again in 2021, which displaced just under 400,000 people. And what they're finding is there's a tremendous increase in organizations, governments, and very fragile governments getting in touch with them, asking them to help to map, measure, and monitor the loss of lands, the problems that was outlined in the first talk, that very much the work that was being done in Uganda. There's an exact replica of that work that's been being done in Syria, and to investigate the impact on populations, particularly, you know, how you lack the cohesion in the structures and how then there's no education and health clinics and etc. affected. And very much then going one further, looking at the instability that many of these people start to very much feel, and then move into how do they unfortunately get sometimes recruited by the wrong people, and also how there are internal conflicts. Then they've been looking very much at what research needs to happen, because one of the things that they've very much seen is so many people are measuring impact in so many different ways. And one of the ways that they constantly are being asked is to look at the financial loss from climate change and the effect on the refugees. And they're finding that there really isn't enough data available, and there is a great gap in the work that needs to be done in that area. And finally, turning to the Walker Institute, they're very much looking at how can they devise a sort of decision-centric framework for the climate risk assessments to ensure there's effective decision-making in every sense, and also looking at all the different metrics that come into this. They've been applying this to working with UNHCR and also UNEP, very much to look at the climate adaptation work and the effect on the population in the African Sahel and in the Middle East region. Very much looking both at national level and also at local level, and looking at the transboundary issues. One of the things they've found is that with so much severe disruption, they're also then finding how many risks they can then identify and how those risk indicators they can then map onto different pathways. One of the things they were highlighting when I asked them very much about thinking about what other research was, how could there become a further sort of work done specifically on the scale of the mismatch between global climate model projections and the local impacts, and also how you can better integrate across disciplines with communities understanding the communities that are being affected by climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. I pass the word directly to Beza Tesfaye, please.
Thank you, Antonio, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure being here. Good morning from Washington, D.C. I am, as mentioned, working at Mercy Corps, which is a humanitarian and development and peace building organization. I oversee our portfolios of applied research on climate change and migration. So my team really focuses on trying to produce evidence and promote its use in programming and policy. So I will be speaking from this perspective, although I've also previously had the eye-opening experience of working in a refugee response context. So a bit of background on Mercy Corps. We work in over 40 countries, including some of the most fragile and challenging contexts. And because of the nature of our work, we're often present and involved in responding to humanitarian crises, including situations of protracted displacement. So just to give you an idea, some of the places that we are actively working in include Ethiopia, Uganda, Jordan, Syria, Bangladesh, Colombia, and others. As you can imagine, we have a lot of different types of programs or responses that we implement that are tailored to the different situations where we work. But a common guiding principle for how we work is that we focus both on helping people meet their immediate needs in these emergency situations, while also trying to help them be able to better cope and adapt in the face of future challenges and shocks. This is an important guiding principle for us because we know that these are oftentimes recurrent challenges that communities are facing, whether it is disasters or economic shocks or conflict. So we are really focused on helping communities in a way building their resilience to these challenges. I really appreciated the research presentations. They're quite interesting. And I'm really glad they looked at this topic of climate vulnerability affecting displaced populations, because it is a topic that I think has important policy implications and is really sort of understudied as an area of research. It made me reflect on how at Mercy Corps we are thinking about these issues, climate change and displacement, and where they intersect. And I'll just share maybe one or two key reflections. The main thing, I think, in terms of how this research speaks to the way in which we approach our work is that within the humanitarian and development sectors, we have a set of policies and programs that are often very limited in how we respond to displacement. And I think this has to be reconsidered as we are increasingly facing a climate crisis. One of the presentations referred to it as warehousing policies, essentially the fact that in many countries where refugees are living, host governments often delimit where refugees can live, restrict their mobility and access to livelihoods and formal employment. And the effect of this we see from our experience is increased vulnerability, marginalization, and a lack of integration. And this is, I think, particularly problematic in the face of climate change, first because we know that mobility in many cases can be an adaptive strategy. We see people move when environmental conditions become harsh, and if there are essentially limits on mobility, we're putting these communities at a greater risk of the negative impacts of environmental hazards, climate vulnerability, and so on. And of course, the lack of access to livelihoods is also problematic because it continues to curb the ability of refugees to become self-reliant and have a dignified life, particularly in situations where they are refugees for many years or for decades. While I think this is still the status quo, there are some reasons to be optimistic that these types of policies are slowly changing in some countries. We see this where we work in places like Colombia and Ethiopia and Uganda, where governments are trying to create more opportunities for refugees by doing things like granting access to land, formal employment, financial services, residency status, and so on. And once this legal and policy framework in refugee hosting countries becomes more permissive, then there is much more we can do as an implementing organization to support not just humanitarian relief, but also adaptation actions for these displaced populations. So I think this needs to be a continued focus of our collective efforts in how we design better programs, but also how we advocate for better policies more broadly. Maybe I'll just skip to some of the research questions, that I think could still be answered, that could have potential applicability in programs and policies related to displacement, migration, or climate change. I want to just touch on three broad themes. One is the role of migration or mobility and adaptation. I kind of referred to this earlier. We know that people are increasingly on the move as a response to environmental outcomes. The question is, when and how does mobility lead to positive well-being or conversely lead to negative well-being? The second theme would be around better understanding the relationship between climate change, displacement, and conflict. There's, I think, a lot of interest around climate security, the role of climate change in conflict or its influence on conflict, but a lot of questions that need to be answered about how the dynamic plays out. And particularly, we often see displacement as contributing to conflict, but we need to better understand under what conditions and where climate-induced migration and displacement may cause conflict. And lastly, a third theme could be generally around understanding integration, social integration of refugees, how we measure it from a social science perspective, what types of programs and policies contribute to it, and also what does integration lead to in terms of adaptation, social cohesion between host and refugee communities, and even potential migration, future migration and movement. Methodologically, I think a lot of this research can be done through micro-level, community-based qualitative or survey research. And that's usually the approach that we take at Mercy Corps. Our comparative advantage in terms of research is that we work on the ground, so we have access to communities, and our research is usually based on field research. But I think there's also a great need for more interdisciplinary and multi-methods research, including I was really excited to see the use of remote sensing to study displacement and migration. I think there's a lot of potential there. Of course, in addition to the use of remote sensing in environmental studies, which has already been quite prevalent. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and looking forward to ongoing discussions on these topics.
Thanks a lot, Beza. So the final panelist, Arjit Singh, please go ahead.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you, everyone, for all the rich and insightful presentations and the comments that we have heard. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I would start my comment that I'm tempted to connect with the previous comments that were made by Dr. Kelman and the responses. I'm from Climate Action Network, and I've also engaged with ActionAid for a long time, working on the issues of displacement and migration. And I would like to connect my experience and the work that we are doing right now. So as Climate Action Network, we also ask that very fundamental question on who is really responsible for the crisis. And the studies that you presented are really great in terms of methodology and the looking at local impacts. But as academicians, as practitioners, as advocates, and especially considering where we are in terms of the climate crisis, when we see millions are getting displaced, it is really important to also look at some of the major drivers of the crisis that we are facing, and the big picture in terms of how inaction and political economy have been largely responsible for driving people out of their homes. Would also like to share this data in terms of how just 100 companies are responsible for 70% of emissions. So which means that we need to also, while we capture these impacts and look at the relationship between people and environment, but also what are the major drivers, and we need to be responding to that. And similarly, the work that Task Force for Displacement has been doing, a fantastic work in terms of how look at the overall picture and how we can develop frameworks and policies. But again, the challenge that we see right now and how years of inaction has brought us to a situation where all the work that we are doing is quite relevant, but somehow doesn't respond to the urgency of the situation. So that's how at Climate Action Network, because I'm sure you know that we are a global network of more than 1,500 civil society organizations spread across 130 countries. And we are working a lot more in this space of demanding social and even racial justice to fight climate crisis. And we are working with various organizations. And at the UN climate talks, we convene and coordinate civil society and also at other international fora. So for us, as I said, it's really important to look at the continuum. Yes, the question on how we look at the projections and what kind of response would be. So for us, it's really important to look at how the problem began and how it is becoming far more complex. Because when we look at the mitigation action or the emission reduction targets, which are absolutely inadequate, and we are living in a 1.1 degree warmer world, and already millions are getting displaced, and we see the ambition that has been put forward by countries is going to take us to more than 3 degree warmer world. And here we are really struggling to meet the target of staying below 1.5 degree. So on one hand, there's a massive gap in terms of mitigation ambition. And we also find that the support that has been provided to developing countries on adaptation has also been insufficient. So what does that mean? If you're not doing adequate mitigation and the support to communities is not going in terms of increasing their adaptive capacity, what it will lead to? It will lead to more loss and damage, as we call it in the UNFCCC space, which means that people are not prepared to deal with climate impacts. And as disasters intensify and their frequency increases, we've also seen how coping mechanisms of communities are failing. So disasters, which we used to call natural, and how their cycle has changed, how they have become far more intense, and communities are not able to adapt and they are not able to cope with the situation. And governments are finding it really hard to support communities when they are hit by these disasters. So when the coping mechanisms of these communities fail, that's the time when they are forced to leave their homes. And even disasters such as sea level rise or desertification are displacing them against their wish. So in that situation, we are looking at various challenges. So the terminology that has become quite acceptable at the UNFCCC space and even beyond, how to look at displacement in terms of averting, minimizing, and addressing. And we need to look at the entire spectrum. We know that humanitarian sector plays an important role in responding to these disasters. But at this moment, the way climate change impacts have increased, even the humanitarian sector is not able to respond to the scale and needs. So that sector is also overstressed and overstretched. And in that situation where we are also facing new challenges, where we will have to permanently relocate people in massive numbers, that's what projection says, we are not really prepared as a global community. Madeline talks a lot more about legal and social protection. This is something that we also look at, and in my previous work and even ongoing engagement with ActionAid, we've looked at how social protection can play a very important role. What are the tools that have worked, how relief needs to be provided, how we need to provide compensation to communities for recovery, but also in terms of legal protection. The work has just begun. So Madeline's example of how UNHCR has started to look at protection and regional international frameworks. I was also engaged in some work with ActionAid on looking at how we can develop a roadmap for regional level framework to protect communities who are forced to cross borders and how their human rights can be protected. So, as Climate Action Network and in my previous engagement with ActionAid, we have done quite a bit of work in 6 countries of South Asia. We have looked at what kind of challenges communities are facing, also particularly from the perspective of women, and what kind of policy framework exists. So in reality, there's not really much, and we've looked at various policy aspects, and there's a huge gap when it comes to disaster response and now how we are going to help communities who are facing climate migration. So that's something that we are looking at. And as Climate Action Network, we are drawing our learning from South Asia, and we'll be expanding to other regions so that we can work very closely with countries so that they can develop their policies and policies that are informed by what challenges people are facing, and their participation is absolutely key. In terms of research gaps, it was really great to see how we are looking at various examples specifically in countries, and that's the point I wanted to make. You know, there are models that are available much more at a meta level, but when it comes to countries, they are not prepared. They really need this kind of information. So downscaling of information, looking at which areas are vulnerable, which communities are at risk. So Jamon's presentation covered a lot as part of various case studies and examples. I think that is an area that does require a lot of support. In fact, you may be aware that at UNFCCC, where we are actively involved in the advocacy work on loss and damage, Santiago Network, which was agreed in 2019, is now in the process of getting established. So we do have an opportunity there to bring that technical experience, what we heard over the last 1.5 hours, such rich knowledge and expertise really required to be shared with countries. And I would really encourage you to engage with the Santiago Network so that we can use some of these methodologies and examples to help countries to assess the impacts based on various models and come up with measures on what needs to be done at various levels. Second, I would say there's a disproportionate emphasis on insurance that is there in response to climate disasters. And we know that it's not really working. And I think we need a lot more empirical study to prove that. In fact, now the insurance sector itself is beginning to recognize that. And I've had several conversations with senior folks from the insurance industry where initially they used to say, yes, it doesn't work in slow onset situation. But now, even in case of extreme weather events, it's not feasible anymore for various locations. Whereas we also see that there's reluctance, particularly at the global level, to look at the issue of social protection. And in my engagement with ActionAid, we have looked at this issue of social protection on how it can really help in averting, minimizing, and addressing displacement or loss and damage in general. I think a lot more research needs to be done to look at what are those tools that have worked in those situations, how we can scale those measures, and how those measures need to be then supported through international support, because we know that developing countries who are facing climate impacts do not have such resources, then social protection measures do help communities in so many ways. Third, I would say, and we did refer briefly to the whole issue of cross-border migration, even if it's a fraction of the scale of the migration that we see, which is much more internal, we also need to look at how we provide them protection, but what are the issues that they are facing, and looking at the number on how many people are already crossing borders, and of course, comparing that with various temperature rise scenarios is also needed. And fourth, I would say across the board, we also need to look at impacts on women. So gender disaggregated data and looking at how women are facing impacts, as well as the role that they can play in responding to climate impacts, and particularly what happens to them in the face of displacement and forced migration. So these are some of the areas that I would like to highlight. Thank you.
Thanks, Arjit. I will now invite all the panelists to switch on their camera and don't hesitate to engage with each other now. I would, and also all the other participants to write comments and questions in the Q&A function if they wish. I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask the panelists just to start the discussion and the conversation. So one is on the temporality of the problems we are addressing here. So we know that normally the problem of displacement here is wrongfully seen as a short temporary problem, while displacement in most cases become protracted. So you have families who have been living in camps for generations, for example, right? At the same time, also humanitarian action is normally very contingent and based on temporary short-term logic. So how do you reconcile then this kind of complicates merging of different temporalities on the ground? The second question is on the effectiveness, if you want to call it like that, of expert knowledge. So to what extent are we able to communicate and to create awareness about, for instance, the nexus of displacement and environmental crisis and so on. So, for example, I was thinking about that when Arjit mentioned disasters, and he said that he used to call them natural disasters. I think among disaster experts and scholars in general, nowadays, there is kind of a peaceful agreement that we are not talking about natural disasters. So these are aggravated and produced by human actions. So they could talk about hazards and so on. But this is not at all kind of very well known among the public at large. So there is a kind of gap between how experts start talking about certain things and then how people continue to see them. I think this specific issue is also Ilan Kelman discusses it in his latest book. So how then we can elaborate best strategies to communicate and create awareness about these things. So feel free. I mean, these are for all panelists. So yeah, Madeline.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Antonio. Really extraordinarily important questions, and I'm sure that Vanessa, Beza, and Hajit will also have viewpoints on it. But perhaps if I could, firstly, on the question indeed of the temporality of refugee protection needs, this is a crucially important point, because indeed the objective that UNHCR has, in fact, as part of its mandate given to it by the General Assembly, is to work with states to find durable solutions to refugees. This was also mentioned by Professor Kelman or previously. And this really has to be a central imperative in which we all need to be investing more. We heard reference in some of the research before the break to warehousing and the extraordinarily difficult circumstances in which many refugees find themselves over generations. And from UNHCR's viewpoint, this is something we have to move away from at all costs, in the interests not only of refugees but also of the communities that host them. So in line with UNHCR's urban refugee policy, we've been seeking to promote indeed opportunities for people while they are still in displacement, to live in communities, to have access to opportunities for livelihoods, to have the ability to move around as they need to. Beza has also referred to this, which means perhaps that some of the analysis that we seek to do may be more complicated. That was highlighted by the research. It's also difficult sometimes for us to deliver assistance to people in these circumstances, but it's essential as a means of enabling them to achieve self-reliance and indeed to work towards better solutions for themselves as well. Concerning solutions, what we've seen, unfortunately, in recent years is really some serious challenges to that. Some 75% of the world's refugee population has been in a protracted situation, meaning displaced in groups of 25,000 or more for 5 years or more in UNHCR's parlance. The Global Refugee Compact, adopted by the General Assembly in 2018, has sought to address this to a certain extent, underlining the crucial importance of seeking to do more to create conditions so people can return in safety and dignity where conditions allow in their home countries. But this raises critical questions indeed for some of those countries where they are climate affected, and this is something that we need to be looking at carefully. We are also seeking, however, to make it clear that states need to do more to create opportunities for people to integrate locally if that is the best solution for them. And also for third countries to offer resettlement options where the people may not be able to find safety or a durable solution where they are. So, this is really something crucial that the Global Refugee Compact has sought to bring more energy to. And it has a clear linkage also to addressing some of the obstacles to the solutions that may arise because of challenges around the effects of climate and disasters. On your second question, indeed, about the nomenclature here, I think it's a very important point, and I believe it's UNDRR, the Disaster Risk Reduction Agency, that has spoken of the challenges around referring to natural disasters in this way. And UNHCR agrees with their analysis that what we see when we are looking at disasters is, in most cases, rather a situation where natural hazards interact with other existing vulnerabilities which have been created or exacerbated in some part by human activity. So where there is poor governance, where there is a lack of appropriate infrastructure, where there is food insecurity. And so a natural hazard which is not a disaster in a wealthy country which has safety nets in place, becomes a disaster which impacts massively on local communities, but also sometimes displaced communities within them, as well as people who may be forced to move because of humanity's failure to put in place better means to address this. And so this is part of what needs to be addressed as part of all of our efforts to mitigate, to adapt and to avoid disasters coming about and affecting people so much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. So, Vanessa?
Thank you very much. Building on the words of Madeline, the one thing that I'm seeing across the world is using geospatial and Earth observation, we often are able to bring greater transparency and greater understanding to people of the temporal nature of what is going on in a particular area, and how perceived interventions aren't always actually making the what perhaps the media and others are suggesting are the resolutions. And certainly with colleagues, certainly around the world, I've worked on several areas where greater transparency from very timely use of Earth observation is making people realize that some of these situations, as they go on, because everyone knows about the intervention that's made soon after an event happens, but they often do not understand what is happening in the longer term. And we're able to collect the data and bring that transparency that other people sometimes wish doesn't even appear, actually. But it's very, very important.
Beza.
Yes, just addition to the first question about the challenges of protracted displacement, I think, as Madeline put it, this is a serious challenge that we see, given the fact that in many cases people will remain refugees for several years now, on average about 20 years. So it is more common that we're seeing situations of protracted displacement than not. I just wanted to add that, I think in addition to thinking about this challenge, part of it is trying to understand why there is reluctance to supporting these sort of policies that increase opportunities for refugees and that don't sort of align with the sort of the warehousing approach that we've discussed. I think part of that is the perception that refugees will create a strain on resources. This was part of the research, I think, from Uganda that came out, that it's this perception that it's the refugees that are kind of contributing to the degradation of the environment, but also that they create a strain on public services, that they displace local workers, they create competition in the employment sector, and they drive down wages. I think what is really interesting is that there's actually a lot of research on this that shows that a lot of these things are actually not true. Refugees do not drive down wages. They do contribute economically and fiscally to host governments. So I think, part of changing these policies is perhaps better communicating evidence that is already there about the contributions that refugees can add and how that could be beneficial to their host communities overall.
Thanks, Ms. Alark.
Yeah, thank you, Antonio. And I wanted to just thank all the panelists for this tremendous kind of response and really enriching our work. So I'm briskly taking notes as you're speaking about some of the major issues. I wanted to quickly point out one discussion specifically on remote sensing, and I think we all would agree in some ways, but I wanted to highlight a few things. One of the projects that we've been working on is on looking at impact of COVID-19 on forest resources and how forest resources might be actually working as safety nets during these times. We are using, and we have our fellow Patrick Jans, who's engaged in this work, trying to look at how the forest has changed, and if this change can be detected from the perspective of if they've really worked as safety net, then the forest should change, and if it not, then we should be able to see it. One of the big challenges is we are recognizing the remote sensing can only look at big trees. And so, but the dependence is on roots and shoots and herbs and this. And so I would just want to say that, yes, it is very important to have remote sensing. And I will say why. Because sometimes there are governments and administrations who are unwilling to let you do an honest research that can give solid evidence. So I strongly support that. But I also would like to advocate a strong pairing of the remote sensing work with on-the-ground work to establish context, to establish causalities, and to really understand what's going on instead of just saying, hey, there is change. And I think that's something useful there. And while I have the opportunity, I wanted to respond to Professor Ilan Kelman's point of, why use fancy words when you can really use simple words? And it starts with writing a proposal when a reviewer responds saying, this is too simple. Where is the fancy word? and so you as an academic who really loves to engage with practitioners who really don't want fancy words, who want solutions and all this, trying to develop a solid research project and be able to convince the reviewers who you don't know what they will get upset about, has been an interesting challenge for me to see, because your comment really reminded me of my advisor, professor, who said, never use a dollar word when you can use 5-cent word. And it's exactly right. But we are in this kind of, worlds where we have to convince folks that you are strong and you can do it. At the same time, if you go too far into this jargon, you start losing the meaning, as you rightly pointed out, Ilan. So I was just reflecting on that, and I appreciate, there is a need for being able to communicate both sides. I see that there is a need to say, how do we advance and research grounds? And final word is, I think in my own research, I'm still recognizing, while practitioners are very comfortable in recognizing the interdisciplinarity, I think academically still there are many disciplines who still want to stay within their disciplines and talk to themselves only. And that the ability to provide an integrating framework that looks both spatially and temporally it becomes for me a very kind of bridging space where people can disagree, but at the same time come on board and then still be able to work together. So as we're talking about these solutions, I do also encourage us to think about some of these fundamental conceptualizations, then that influence in the later part how the solutions arrive, whether it's in the short term or in the long term. So thank you.
Thanks, Alark. So I have Arjit and then Anwesha.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll be quick. A lot of points have been covered. I'll particularly like to respond to the first question on the humanitarian response, on how it is inadequate, and particularly, in terms of time bound. I think that's exactly the fight that we are having again at UNFCCC. And I would like to bring in the whole topic of loss and damage finance, because whenever we talk about increasing impacts and responding to these impacts, we are always pointed towards humanitarian response, which we know is insufficient and inadequate. So how do we look at it? And let me share a number. The studies are saying that we will be seeing impacts and damages to the tune of $290 to $580 billion a year by 2030. That's the scale we are talking about. And the overall climate action number is still stuck to $100 billion, which includes everything. So the response is not commensurate to what is needed. And that's why, even if we develop some of these methodologies, which are going to be great, but essentially, then governments would need money to respond. And if we do not address climate impacts, which means if the humanitarian response is not timely, if we don't provide resources to communities to recover from climate impacts, what are we going to see? Displacement and migration. So how we need to really look at the whole issue of loss and damage, as we call it in the UNFCCC space, and make sure that the response that we have is commensurate to the need, we will see a lot more displacement and migration. So the fight that we are having as the so-called climate community has to become everybody's fight. We talk about multidisciplinary work in terms of research. I would say we also need that in our advocacy efforts. We need humanitarian community, development community, colleagues who are working on migration and displacement. Everybody has to come together and say, we want to avert and minimize and address the issue. I think that whole spectrum is needed. Thank you.
Yes, there is indeed the issue of a financial gap, but there is also the issue of how these money are used. That is less often discussed. So Anwesha.
Yeah, I'll be very, very quick. Thank you, everyone, for these extremely insightful discussions. And I have been frantically tweeting, summarizing whatever you said. So it's all on Twitter, documented, live tweets. Very quickly, something that came up in the research panel and later is this thing about at the top, we have this climate science, all these projections, all these numbers. But how is the community that we work with, that we term as vulnerable? Because I think sometimes we're really taking away this thing about agency. There's also something called burdened agency. And how do they actually perceive that? So we are making all these distinctions between climate change, environmental degradation, slow onset, rapid onset. But what is actually going on at the community level, and how are these being perceived? And there is essentially a lack in communication, or we may call it translation or information uptake. And that, I think, is extremely important to do if we were to work together, be it in a multidisciplinary way, be it in a multi-methods way, or multi-organizational, research policy framework way. And I think right now there's some work that is going on in bridging this gap between, these IPCC reports. But, what is this coastal community in Bangladesh got to do with what IPCC projections are saying? So I think we need to be more realistic on what we do, what we say, and really do these grounded approaches and do some form of integration and bridging at different layers. So we mainly discuss the national frameworks, the regional, but then we need to go to the ground and do some form of that bridging and interactions. But that's about it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anwesha. I think I have the unpleasant duty of interrupting this interesting discussion. I thank a lot again all the panelists, Vanessa, Harjit, Beza, and Madeline. Thanks a lot for joining us today. And thanks all the participants for bearing with us until the very end. It was very well appreciated. If you want to stay in touch, so Anwesha has been tweeting and posting throughout the conversation. You can also be in touch with us through the website of the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies. And here you can see some of our Twitter and accounts and websites, also including the University of Dundee and the Christian Michelsen Institute. So thanks again to everyone. Bye.